Hello. I'm going to quickly go over how to install and use my Aurora shader halo. So when you install the halo, you should find a folder called Zek Halos Aurora Halo in your project. And this folder has everything that you'll need to install the halo. To start, you'll find the Aurora prefab in the base Aurora Halo folder, and you should simply drag that onto your avatar. You'll notice here that the halo appears already lined up with my head. That's because I've already set up the prefab for my head. However, you may have to move the halo up or down in local or global space in order to get it perfectly on your head. Once it's on your head, provided you have VRC Fury installed, it's good to go. Let's take a look at some of the shader settings for the Aurora Halo. They can be divided up into a few specific sections, but we're going to start with textures first. The Aurora texture largely shouldn't be touched. This is a map that holds some information used by the Aurora, specifically the lines here, as well as two different gradients that accomplish different things. The blend-in texture is a texture that you absolutely can touch. It's used to blend in a second effect underneath the Aurora. So one example could be these lines you can see, or even cells like this. This texture that comes with Poyomi happens to be a really good blend-in texture for a nice natural Aurora effect. It almost looks like wind. And so I would recommend leaving it like that if you just want a normal Aurora. Aurora texture density controls how tiled this texture is, and it functionally makes the Aurora have more or less lines. So you can see here that we can get a lot of lines, or very few lines. Personally, I find that 2.5 is a great setting for a natural looking Aurora. Aurora texture multiple lets you multiply the color of the texture. Personally, I think leaving this on 1 will be the right move. However, for some cases, you might want to lower or increase it. Aurora texture speed controls the panning speed of the texture. Turning it up, you can see that the Aurora gets faster. All these settings are also available for the blend-in texture, so you can see the same, that tiles the blend-in texture. Lets me control how bright, dim the texture is, and the speed of the texture. Under the color settings, here's where you can choose which colors to use for your Aurora. So for example, I could use red and yellow. You can see that we have a yellow here and a red here, etc. We also have a hue shift. This hue shifts the entire Aurora. A color shift speed, so you can set this to a value to have it automatically hue shift, as you can see there. There's a distortion color strength, shift strength. This has to do with these UV distortions that cause the wave to slow down and speed up. You can cause them to have a hue shift depending on how strong that is. Finally, there's vertical color shift. So if you look at pictures of real Aurora, you'll often see that at the very tip, there's like a little bit of extra color. This lets you control that. It lets you hue shift as you go up the texture. Turning this off, you'll just get directly the colors that you want. For example, red and yellow here. Personally, I'm a big fan of having this up a little bit. And if I wanted a more rainbowy effect, I would likely use this, which creates a nice variant of colors across. Let's return back to where we were originally. The Aurora Fresnel determines how quickly the Aurora fades off on the edges. So you can see if I turn this up, it fades off really softly. And if I turn this down, it fades off super harshly. Personally, this is how I control the subtlety of the effect. If you want it to be really subtle, you can turn the Aurora Fresnel way up. And if you want it to be not so subtle, you can turn it way down. Once again, the default value of 5 works really well as a middle ground. Final power and final multiple control the final effect's power and multiple, so it's literally the final effect raised to whatever value that you have in here. This lets you completely break it, but also get a more concentrated effect. This can also be used with the multiple to multiply it up, and then shrink it down to get almost wispy effects. Seam hide power and seam hide multiple have to do with this mesh. If you look very carefully on the back, there's a little seam there, and this just helps hide that. You can see that if I turn down the power, there's almost like a gradient away from that seam. And if I turn down the multiple, everything kind of goes down because it's where the seam is not. Honestly, at the default settings, no one is ever going to notice the seam, so you can probably leave it there. Star ratio has to do with the little stars that you can see in the Aurora. This is more for if you plan on changing the mesh itself, like scaling it. You can see that if I scale it up, the stars become really, really elongated. So you could use this value to make the stars more circular again. Keep in mind, they'll always be distorted by the UV distortion, so it will never be perfect. Star speed controls the speed of the panning of the stars. Star mass subtract lets you have more or less stars. The way that these stars are done is just a grid that I mask out. So you can see as I reduce that, more and more stars are visible to a greater extent. Personally, I think keeping this up above 0.9 is a good idea. You can see it already gets to be a bit much when we go down to 9.1, but you barely get any stars at 9.8 and 9.9. 9.5 is a good middle ground. UV distortion strength. So as I mentioned before, you can see areas where the UVs are distorted to give it that flowy effect. If you turn this up, you'll see that it distorts more. Keep in mind that because of how UVs work, once you go like above 1, like you're sampling multiple UV tiles over, and it can get really out of hand really quick. Personally, I think 0.3, which is the default, is like perfect for this. Maybe a touch higher or a touch lower. UV distortion scale. So this has to do with the scale of the noise that's used to do the distortion. So you can see if I turn this up, the distortion is a little bit more localized. And if I turn it down, the distortion is a lot bigger, such that in this case it is even barely noticeable. Like I say a lot, the default value is a good middle ground for this. Distortion speed is just how quickly that distortion texture moves. Morph speed has to do with the distortion texture, or rather distortion noise, being panned in the other direction. So you'll notice if I turn this up, that stuff moves a lot more. This is because of how I do the noise. It's essentially moving a 1D line up or down on the noise. Kind of hard to explain, but it's basically noise that changes without having to actually move the UV of the noise. Finally, there are some advanced settings. These are settings that I had tuned over time and then normalized them to 1. Most people won't ever need to touch these, and they can have some pretty wacky effects. The shader does use Thry locking, so that means once stuff is locked in, you won't be able to edit it unless you set it as animated. So please keep that in mind. yeah, thank you for watching. If you have any questions or issues, feel free to contact me through my Discord server. Just make a ticket, and yeah, have a nice day. Thank you for watching.